something we've never done before. We are live streaming, which we do, but we're live streaming on new places. We've never live streamed before. We're live streamed on the Village Church. We're live streamed on Everybody's Church. We're live streamed on YouTube. We're live streamed on Tinder. Tinder, that's not one of the new, what's the platform? It's not Twitch. Twitch. I don't even know what Twitch is, but it's different, I think. Anyway, so we're going to be live streaming all over the place, and I am super excited about that. Of course, I know you've already found the coffee, and I want you to know afterwards we want you to be able to stay as long as you'd like, be able to meet Amber, spend time with her, drink coffee. What's that? You can start helping me. That's what I found it. It's on. 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Done that. Got my bed? So y'all, we got to run the whole beginning again. Sorry. Am I okay? Quick. All right. Am I okay in the back, guys? Am I okay? All right. Anyway, delighted that you are here. It's going to be a fantastic night, I promise. So, Amber Cantorna is an author, speaker, blogger, musician, and leader in the movement of acceptance and inclusion for LGBTQ Christians. Amber is the author of 2 books, Refocusing My Family, Coming Out, Being Cast Out, and then Discovering the True Love of God, which came out in 2017. She's also the author of Unashamed, a coming out guide for LGBTQ Christians, which came out last year. Amber's been featured on PBS and NPR, as well as in the Huffington Post, Pathos, and many other newspapers and magazines. Amber and her wife Clara were married in 2014, and Amber now dedicates her time to writing, speaking, educating, and sharing her story in order to bring hope to other LGBTQ plus people of faith. I've read both of her books, and I've followed and admired very much the work she's doing. She is making a profound difference in our world, and I am now proud, in conjunction with Affinity Atlanta, to welcome to our stage, all the way from Denver, Colorado, would you make her welcome, Amber Cantorna. Amber. I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you. Thank you. So you don't find this weather cold at all. This is nothing for you.
Where's the sun?
I know, man.
I thought it was going to be warm here. It's like Denver in Georgia.
I know. We need it to be a little warmer. Next time you come, we'll make sure it's a
I
little
was not prepared. Nobody told me it was going to be this cold in Georgia.
Your story is similar to so many stories that I've heard about LGBT people coming out, and yet your story is also a little different because you grew up with a dad who was 30 years top executive with a ministry that is world-renowned, focused on the family. That had to be pretty crazy. So can we spend the first half of our time just kind of getting your story, where you come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Colorado Springs. I was actually born in Montana. And then we moved to actually Southern California when Focus on the Family was still based in Southern California in the very early days. And then when they moved to Colorado Springs in 1991, we migrated with them. And so that was where I really spent most of my growing up years. And a lot of evangelical ministries moved into Colorado Springs around that same time. And so it became kind of this mecca of evangelical ministries. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom who homeschooled us K through 12. My dad worked at Focus on the Family. And so that was really my world. That was really all that I knew, was to be kind of inculcated in this Christian bubble. And people would look at me and say, well, you just have the perfect family. You know, everything must be so perfect. And in many ways it was. My parents did a lot of things very well. And so I'm very thankful for that. And I was very much cocooned in this Christian bubble where I wasn't really exposed to diversity at all, whether that was people of color or people with disabilities or certainly the LGBTQ community, right? Like that was very far out there. And so my world was small. It was very black and white. Things were very right and wrong. And so we were kind of deemed as like the chosen people of God, right? That was supposed to go out and minister to as many people as possible and bring them into the fold. That was like our mission, and to be a blessing to others. So I felt like I always had to kind of wear this facade all the time, or at least appear to be happy,
Right.
and have it put together, because that was just what Christian people did. You were supposed to be a blessing to other people, which kind of meant you always had to have it all together, you know? And so I started feeling that pressure as I grew older, to uphold the family name, to represent my family well, because everybody knew what my dad did, everybody knew who my mom was. She was kind of a pillar in the homeschool community. And so really that was who I became in essence in a lot of ways. And that started to weigh on me as I got older.
When I was reading your book, and her first book is her memoir, and it is worth it. Everybody, you need to read this, because as someone who grew up evangelical, you were living in like the dream. As I'm reading how perfect your family was, how perfect the traditions that you guys did. Do y'all remember the show that was on? Many of y'all remember Focus on the Family? Do y'all know what we're talking about, Focus on the Family? Do you remember the show Adventures in Odyssey? It was. Do you know she was one of the voice actors as a teenager on Adventures in Odyssey? So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I would have held you guys in such esteem. And then I'm realizing that there's a little girl in the middle of all of this that is feeling some pressures and some things that aren't so perfect.
Right. And there was, like I said, there was a lot of wonderful things about it. And I attributed that to my parents, because there was a lot. I mean, they worked hard to pay for music lessons. And, you know, my mom taught us to perform from a very young age. And those are things I still look back on very fondly. But I did start feeling that pressure. And, you know, our range of emotions at home were very limited. So you could be happy or blessed or excited, but there wasn't room for emotions of sadness or anger or disappointment. And so learning to navigate that was hard, because I felt like you always had to be over here. There was no room to be over here. And that began to weigh on me more as I got older. As I went into my teen years, I started wrestling with more anxiety, more depression, and especially as I moved into like purity culture and into my teens, I just started to feel that pressure to uphold the family name and to represent my family well. And so it's like that came with a certain amount of responsibility. And so as I grew up and then moved into my teens, I was heavily involved in the purity culture. That was a huge part of my upbringing. When I was 13 years old, my family had a big like coming of age, coming into womanhood ceremony, and all my friends and family came around, and we did this huge. Everything was steeped in symbolism and, you know, meaning. And my dad gave me this purity ring that had a cross and a heart, and symbolized that God held the key to my heart, you know, until I got married. Oh, you're on now, aren't you? And so and I signed this vow, you know, that I would save sex for marriage. And I think that what I didn't realize at the time was how much that really masked my ability to understand my sexual orientation earlier on. So I didn't realize I was gay till I was about 23, 24 years old. And that's because this belief of purity culture was that if you just follow God with your life and you just do the next right thing, eventually your knight in shining armor is going to come in on a white horse and sweep you off your feet to happily ever after. And so I just kept waiting for that, and I just kept serving God, and I just kept doing the next right thing. Even in the midst of a lot of struggle, I had a very close relationship with God. And so I was at New Life Church for 14 years, a big mega church, and that was a place of great safety for me for a lot of those teenage years. You know, like a lot of people will ask me, well, how did you hold on to your faith through everything and through the coming out and all the grief and loss? And I really attribute a lot of it to those teenage years when, you know, I didn't really have a safe place to go. I didn't really have a safe person to go to. And I would just sit in the back of my church for hours every week with my Bible and worship music and my journal and just write out my heart to God. And I really think that foundation of being able to do that solidified kind of for me the difference between knowing God for myself and having a personal relationship with God and what people were doing to me in the name of God.
Right.
And so I think being able to make that distinction really helped me navigate those coming years.
I was blown away, and I also was blown away. You were this gifted musician. You graduated high school at 16, graduated college at 18. She graduates from college, and you're living in this world, and yet because of a little bit of OCD and some perfectionistic kind of things, you're experiencing anxiety, depression, pulling your hair, and eventually even cutting yourself kind of as a way to deal with some of this trauma or stress that you're feeling?
And I did have a couple traumatic events in my childhood
Right.
without any safe outlet to really process those. And so I think the combination of all those things, and when I look back now, I can see the fact that I was gay from a very early age.
Right.
But I did not have the exposure or the vocabulary to be able to put those terms or those labels on it. And so that just was a part of, I think, the angst that was growing inside of me, is that I knew I didn't fit in, I knew I didn't belong, but I didn't know why, because I didn't have those pieces of information that I needed to put it all together.
One of the things I was just thinking, we were talking, we have friends, of course, family members who aren't inclusive and affirming in their world at all, and they hear of a church like this church, and they think, well, why are you exposing children to people who are different than maybe what they think is the norm and what it should be? And it's like I think of your story and I think, why wouldn't I want my grandchildren to be around fabulous gay people and fabulous our transgender siblings? Why wouldn't I want my grandkids to grow up so they know in the full expression of life, whatever it is, they belong, they fit, and not like, I don't even know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and even as we were talking earlier today about internalized homophobia, if you're exposed to diversity from a young age, that doesn't grow inside of you the same way as if you're only exposed to people that are straight, heteronormative, all these things. It becomes easier to identify yourself and to accept yourself because you see diversity everywhere around you and you see that being celebrated. And so you learn to be able to celebrate that within yourself.
Let me ask you something. One of the stories that really moved me, you meet someone named Brooke in the book named Brooke, and you begin to experience feelings you've never known before, and Brooke ends up not only being kind of a love for you, but then Brooke outs you to your parents. That sucked.
Yeah, that sucked is right.
Yeah. Talk about that just a minute.
Well, that's a lot to talk about for just a minute, but falling in love with Brooke was my epiphany of horror, because it was like, oh crap,
I bet.
like this is the one thing that is never supposed to happen, and I had never felt those feelings before, and I had never experienced that, and so it was a shocker. And then you have your hierarchy of sin, and that tops out at the very top of what you're not supposed to be as a Christian. And I just didn't know what to do. And then she outs me in the middle of the night, takes off, and my parents show up on the doorstep at 6:30 the next morning and interrogate me. And it was very much, well, one, they said, Amber, don't ever tell anybody about this, because if you do, it will ruin your reputation forever. And I think they were more scared of it ruining their reputation forever. And so it kind of ended up getting swept under the rug as this big mistake that never should have happened. And we're just not really going to talk about it, and we're going to move on like everything's fine. And you're still going to find your knight in shining armor, and you're still going to go on and do all these things that we have expected for you to do. And so it kind of just was the elephant in the room that you didn't talk about. Meanwhile, I didn't tell anybody, and I retreated further into the closet, which only made me spiral further downward, because the amount of shame and guilt that I held inside of me and that I was carrying around was eating me alive. And so I was dealing with a great amount of self-injury and self-hatred and suicidal ideations, and it was a dark spiral. And so it eventually came to the point where I realized I'm either going to have to look this thing in the face, or it's going to be the thing that kills me.
Right.
And so I didn't even know where to start. Like, where do you even start? When you think, when you're that perfect Christian inside this bubble, you have no idea that places like this even exist.
Right.
Like, you think you are the only person in the world that could possibly show up gay in a conservative Christian family. You have no exposure to the outside of what is possible for you. And so I didn't even know where to start. And of course, the resources we have now are greatly different than what we had back then, 10 years ago even. Like, it has grown so much over the last decade. So I just did the best that I had with the best I could with what I had. I didn't even know where to start, and so I put myself in therapy, which was a really great idea.
How did you find how did you have the wisdom to you knew not to go to a evangelical church therapist, that wasn't going to be...
That I did know.
Right.
Because we did try to go to our pastor, who then spread it through other pastors, that became a whole nightmare mess too. So I knew not to go to church. I knew not to go to my family. I knew all of that was headed towards reparative therapy, and that wasn't going to be helpful. Because I already knew how to hate myself. I didn't need somebody to teach me that. So I needed somebody that was going to help me figure a way out. And a friend of mine had just recommended a therapist that she knew. And I don't know that I had the wisdom at the time to be like, I think I knew this is outside the realm of conservative Christian therapists. But I don't know that I had the language that I do now to say this is what you want to look for in a therapist. But it just happened to be a great fit. And she respected my faith journey. She respected my journey with trying to discover my sexuality and how those might fit together. She let me bring my dog with me, which was very therapeutic, And so those things all just really helped me navigate my emotions for the first time in a place that I had never had that before, to be able to experience the full range of emotions, And that was really helpful to start identifying some of those things that I was feeling and experiencing that I was really good at stuffing stuff down really, really far and just pretending it didn't exist. And so the therapy was a huge part of my process of acceptance.
And so was this the time that you decided to look up and see if there was an affirming church?
Yeah, that was in the process of all that. I finally kind of was at my wit's end of these things I don't think can ever coexist, but I'm just gonna try. And there's a lot of fear behind that too, because of what you've been taught, that they've thrown the Bible out the window, that they disrespect the Word of God, that they are heretic, all the negative stereotypes that you have built up in your head is what you've been taught that this group of people is. And I didn't want to be pegged as that, because I still loved God very deeply. And so I really I didn't want to just justify my way of life, like people tell you. I really wanted to know what the Bible said, and I really wanted to know what God thought. And I was just as terrified to find out that God was okay with me being gay as I was to find out that God was not okay with me being gay, because I knew that either way my life was going to drastically change forever.
So you look up, you're still 30 miles, I guess, from Denver, maybe farther?
Yeah, more like 70.
70 miles. So you look up and you find a church in Denver that seems like it may be a place that you could go and hear the other side of the story?
Yeah. And so I was terrified, and I reached out to the pastor, and he very quickly responded with a warm welcome and invited me to come. And I was so terrified that first Sunday I drove up there, I didn't know what to expect or what I was going to find. I think I had equated it to Pride Parade in church, And that's
so you thought they were going to be wearing chaps with butts hanging out and stuff like that.
Drag queens and people making out everywhere, the whole 9 yards, And I walked in and I was like, these people all look just like me.
Amazing.
And it was amazing. And they were just normal people loving
Amazing.
each other and loving God. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And as I saw them interact with each other and their love for their partner and their spouse and their love for God with no conflict in between, I was I realized that day that it was possible. And I remember going home and writing in my journal that night something to the effect of, I've passed the point of no return. There's no going back, because I saw that it was possible. And I can't go back to this suffocating life that I've been living.
That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. You wrote in your book, you said, my heart had camped in the midst of angst, worry, fear, and doubt for so long. But eventually I realized these are not the attributes of God. And then you used the scripture. Jesus said, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. And you said the love you experienced when attending that church and the peace you began to feel deep inside about your sexuality, the joy you found in knowing that you're beautifully unique, these were the fruits of the Spirit that told me I was in a good and healthy place. You're a gifted writer. That is just beautiful. I just cried. I just would read that and I think, my stars. That's
well,
so
and it was
perfect.
so true, because in my life I had struggled for so long. I just was always wrestling, always struggling, never really at peace. And those are not the fruits of God, self-hatred and self-loathing and self-harm. And, like these are not attributes of God. And when I finally made the step to come out, and I know I'm getting a bit ahead of the story, but when I made that step, it was like chains and shackles fell off of me, and I felt so free and alive for the first time. And I was like, these are the attributes of God. The joy that I felt like finally feeling at home in my own skin and finally realizing that I had found the peace that was missing all my life. And it was just so liberating to be able to walk into that, even in the midst of all that was going on in terms of grief and loss with family.
So you're going to this church, you're meeting new friends, you're feeling, but you're totally in a separate city. When you're there, it's a different world, and you finally realize it's time to come out?
I think when I had finally gotten all the pieces I needed to reconcile my faith with my sexuality and understand who I was and be okay with who I was, and then find that affirming community and have that support, when I felt like, because I was pretty strategic about it, like I was very careful about not coming out to my family until I was ready, and so I was pretty strategic in the way that I did that. But once I had all those pieces in place, I knew I was going to have to come out. Like there was no going around that. It's not like some families who like live on opposite sides of the country and see each other once a year and they just kind of fake it, Like that would never work. We all lived within a mile of each other. We talked every day. We did everything together. We were the focus on the family, And so I knew that I was going to have to come out. And I sat my parents down one day and told them my story and told them the journey that I had been on and the journey that I had taken with God, because I knew that was going to be their greatest fear, right? And they just glazed over with this deer in the headlights look. And I don't know that they heard a word that I said. And I waited to say, like the big G word until the very end, because I knew that like that was going to kind of be the end. And I finally got it out and I finally said it. And it was the most vulnerable I've ever felt. And it just hung in the air. And my dad just looked at me and he said, "I have nothing to say to you." And he got up and walked out the door. And so that was devastating, like that rejection, immediate rejection was devastating, because there was no amount of like trying to seek to understand or really listen to where my heart had been and the journey that I'd taken. And then we didn't speak for like 3 weeks, which was an eternity for my family, And when we did, it was another interrogation of, they compared me to murderers and to pedophiles and said, "We feel like you've died. How dare you do this to our family? You're so selfish." And it was just heart-wrenching for me to hear that from your own parents, And then as I got ready to leave, my dad asked me for the keys to the house back. And, I wasn't living there, but that was my childhood home. That's where I had grown up and, always stopped by for different things. And he asked for the keys to the house back and said they no longer felt safe with me having access to their home.
I can't tell you, I know Jane will remember, I was reading your book and big tears rolling down my face. When I met you today, and I'm dead serious, I'm giving you the code to my back door, and you have it forever, because that was, I just couldn't imagine what it felt like. You're a good person. And you've been on this journey with God, and to have that response, that was tough. And then your dad even had surgery afterward, and you were taking care of him.
Yeah.
But nothing changed.
No, nothing changed. And I think part of me had I didn't do it with the hopes of something that would change. I did it because it's the right thing to do.
Right thing to do.
But I think there was a part of me that was hoping that somehow that kind of end of life experience would have changed or softened him a bit, and it just didn't in the least. At all. So that was hard too, because it just, as time went on, we just kept getting further and further apart. And then that about a year after that experience, after he was sick, not even a year, it was about probably 8 months is when I got married, and I had no family at my wedding. And I was grateful for the affirming community that I had, because they're the ones that stepped up and stood in for my parents where they should have been, But nothing replaces your family. Like, we can never get those years back. I feel like they've missed the happiest years of my life, They've never seen this Amber. They've never known me, because I always struggled. So they've never seen this person who is confident and comfortable in her skin and at peace and has joy. Like they've never seen that part of me. So I feel like they've missed the happiest years of my life as I got married and bought a house and family and that kind of stuff. So nothing replaces that. You just continue to grieve layers of loss, over time. But then you also meet other incredible people and you build community with them, and they're rich and they're authentic. And I felt like I lived kind of in this Barbie doll world where everybody just wore a mask all the time and nobody was real with each other. And people on this side are, like, you don't just end up here. You have to go through some stuff to get here, like it's a journey. So the people that are here are rich and authentic and deep, and I've just met some of the most incredible people.
I love that. Hey, you write about, you mentioned her earlier, Half Pint. Half Pint was helpful for you.
Half Pint was very helpful for me, and she's traveled with me a lot over the last few years, and in recent months, not as much because my health is changing in other ways and become challenging, but she's been a service dog for PTSD for a number of years, and she was really a lifesaver for me. And she's very mad that she's not here, by the way. I've gotten pictures. She's not happy. And so, but she was very instrumental in just having that heartbeat, having that connection with somebody, where you have a reason to stay alive. And we've bonded very quickly. And so over time, as things with my family went so far south, I talked to my doctor about having her trained as a service dog, and she wholeheartedly approved, was like, oh, I think that's a great idea, And it wasn't hard to do because she was already so inclined to my emotions and to what I was going through, and she still does a beautiful job of that, even though she can't be with me all the time. So I really think my affirming community and having Half Pint are the things that really saved my life in those tough times.
So you're dealing with this with your family, you're going to this church, your life is opening up, and you meet Clara. How did that happen?
Well, we met at the affirming church that I was attending, and I was single when I came out, and I met her the following year, and it was really kind of perfect timing after I had gone.
Did you date a lot? Did you date?
I did not date a lot. I really didn't date. I didn't date at all. After I came out, before I met Clara. She was the first person I dated after I came out, because that year was very hard and I was not in a place where I was ready to date.
Right.
And so I didn't date at all that year. I dated some in this season where I was like trying to figure things out and like, am I sure I'm gay? Am I bi? Am I, maybe, the whole thing of like, well, you just need to date guys because you haven't dated guys, and so you just need to date guys to find out that you're not gay, I did the whole thing. Still gay.
That didn't.
Still gay.
Yeah.
So I did all that, but then when I came out, I didn't date at all that year, and then Claire was the first person I dated after that.
And she came to hear you speak at the church.
She did, yeah. I was sharing my life story that morning, and she just happened to show up and be there for one of the first times at that church, and we met there, and then a couple months later started dating, and it moved pretty quickly. We only, between when we met and when we got married was only about a year and a half, so it moved fairly quickly.
In your wedding, I've seen pictures. It looked like it was a beautiful.
This is a picture, actually. This is our wedding.
On the book, yes.
On the book, yeah.
That's beautiful.
So it was a great day. That season was so wonderful and still so challenging because you're falling in love for the first time, but you can't share that with your family, and you're dealing with all this grief and loss, but you're falling in love, and all these beautiful things are happening. And so it felt like such a roller coaster of emotions, where it was like the things you'd always dreamed of are finally happening, and yet your family's falling apart. And like I remember seasons of just intense nightmares leading up to the wedding, and knowing that my family wasn't going to be apart, and I was sobbing so hard in my sleep I'd wake myself up because I was crying so hard, and so there were very difficult moments in the midst of that.
I know she's a friend of yours. She's a friend of ours, Sarah Cunningham and Liz Dyer, and some of that group of people who have said, hey, if you're having a wedding and your mom and dad won't come, you let us know, and we'll be there for you.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you had some supportive friends, and I know that they have become really good friends.
Yes, they are. I have so much respect for both of them. I think they're doing such amazing work in the world.
Well, y'all, this is that book that she's been talking about thus far, The Refocusing My Family, and I could not recommend a book higher to everyone. It's going to become, I'm going to give it out to people that have maybe wondered about being Christian and gay, because it was just so obvious that you loved God as you're wrestling with this. Can this be? And I found it to be a beautiful, beautiful example. Now I want to move to us talking about this book a little bit. So I'm assuming there were years between that book and this book, and you just kind of took a sabbatical.
I wish.
How did that happen?
I wish. No, this book had only been out for about 3 months before I got approached for that book. And, writing a memoir is not easy to figure out how to share all of your vulnerable pieces of your life with the world. And it was a grueling process. I went through every document, every journal entry, every scrapbook. I reviewed my entire life from the very beginning and tried to pull out the threads that I felt like people would identify with the most. And so it was a tough process. And so when I was approached 3 months later for this one, I was like, not even close, don't even talk to me. But when God tells you to write a book, you write a book. And so I literally came off tour for this and had foot surgery and wrote that in 6 to 8 weeks while I recovered from foot surgery at home. But I quickly realized the need for it, because what I was seeing on the road was, one, people were asking the same questions over and over and over of, how do I know when I'm ready to come out? What if my parents are in ministry? What if I'm in ministry? Just the same, it just felt like they were on repeat. The emails that I was getting and the messages and the people I met, all asking the same questions. And then I realized too that we've got some great resources that are helping people reconcile their faith with their sexuality, but nothing after that to help them navigate the journey forward of, okay, I'm gay and I'm Christian, or I'm trans and I'm Christian, now what? And so this is a holistic approach to help them navigate that process moving forward. And I take all the most commonly asked questions that I've received on the road and the stories of a few other people that have allowed me to share their stories and compiled it into what I hope is a helpful guide.
And it's very helpful. I love that you start right away, too, with lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peers. And LGB youth who come from highly rejecting families are over 8 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to their LGB peers who report no or low levels of family rejection. And then 40% of transgender adults have reported attempting suicide, with 92% of them doing so before age 25. And so I could just tell that this was, as you became immersed in what people were going through and you realized it wasn't just I could see you were really drawn into this as something that you have to do.
Yeah, well, because it's so vital, because the majority of those people who are rejected by their families are rejected for religious reasons. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, is where the problem stems. And so I feel like I've got a critical part to play in that.
You mentioned it earlier, but I want to go back to it because I've been a pastor for nearly 40 years. You write about homophobia and transphobia, and then you talk about internal homophobia and transphobia. Can you just go more into depth? Because I thought this was profound, and it's going to be very helpful to me.
Well, I think people don't realize that just because you're gay or non-binary or trans doesn't mean you don't have that homophobia or transphobia still living inside of you. We're trained that way from the time that we're born. Unless you are, for most people, unless they're adopted, they grow up in a family that looks like them. They've got their mom's eyes or their dad's smile, But if you are adopted or you're LGBT, you grow up and you start realizing, well, I don't look like that. I don't fit that norm. That doesn't. And so you start having these seeds of shame that are planted inside of you that, unless you have something that counteracts them, they just continue to grow. So the parents that are now training their kids that diversity is beautiful and is to be celebrated, those kids are going to have no problem growing up because they know that those things are valued. But for people like us who have not had that as the norm, and you've seen that as kind of when you've been taught to hate a group of people, and then that group of people is you start to hate yourself. And so that grows inside of you, and until you have a truth that counteracts the lie, it's going to continue the cycle.
You wrote about turning on the radio one day and hearing Franklin Graham and James Dobson, and they were talking about LGBT, and it was horrible what they were saying. And you told me this morning that even now you will have that homophobia it'll just kind of shoot across your mind just quickly.
It doesn't, I don't think it ever goes away. When you've had 30 years of bad theology and
Right.
teaching steeped into you. It takes a long time to get that out. But I think what's important is surrounding yourself with affirming people, because the more that you keep yourself in a non-affirming environment, the more you're going to replay those tapes of that who you are is bad. And so the more that you can steep yourself in an affirming place, the more that you're going to have those positive tapes that reinforce that who you are is to be celebrated and is beautiful in the eyes of God. And I think that's where you need to spend the majority of your time. And that's a boundary issue, is learning how to navigate your way away from non-affirming places and into healthy places.
You said in the end of that segment, you said sadly, we've come to trust the conservative church more than we trust our inner voice. Mm-hmm. And we have to learn to trust that inner voice that says, this is how I am. This is how I was made this way. This is beautiful me. This is me.
Yeah, because I think we've been taught as evangelical or conservative Christians that whoever your pastor is or whoever's in authority over you is the voice of God. And they are 100% right, and you need to just absorb that into your life instead of listening to that inner voice that you have of the Holy Spirit inside of you that's telling you who you are. And I think that we often negate that in lieu of trying to trust the bigger voice of God that we've heard from a stage or a platform or a person, instead of trusting the voice of God within us.
I love that you gave to people who were contemplating coming out, you gave them some thoughts, and I can tell you're very, that you had thought it through when you were going through it, so I thought it was beautiful. You talk about the importance of an affirming community, and I'm guessing for you that was that initial church that you found in Denver, and you talked about a good therapist. And these are things that you would recommend, I guess, to anyone. If they're struggling with coming out, these are pieces that are important to have. A close friend, a pet, a small group, and then you said a hotline. And I thought that was interesting. I guess even with everything good, there's times that you just think, I can't make it, I cannot do this.
Well, and not everybody has a close knit of friends that they feel safe to reach out to.
Okay.
And so knowing that a hotline is available is a comfort to a lot of people, and there's no shame in that. In fact, they just recently, a few months ago, I think, created a text hotline where you don't even have to be on the phone. You can text and receive via text a hotline as well, which I think the younger generation really appreciates. So there's even more options opening up.
You talked about welcoming and affirming, and I know we've talked about it before here, but can you just kind of give us your take on the welcoming and affirming church thought, because some people don't know the difference?
Yeah, so you want to find an affirming church that celebrates all of who you are, because what we're seeing now is that a lot of the conservative evangelical churches are pulling from these churches, trying to use the same lingo and kind of, sneakily get by and make everybody think that they're welcome when they're really not. So they'll say, well, everybody's welcome. But what they mean is, well, you're welcome to sit in the pews and give your tithe and maybe serve in a lesser role like hospitality. But when it comes to serving on the worship team or in the children's ministry or getting married, they draw a line. And so what is happening is that people are going in thinking they're safe and building relationships and starting to put down roots and then realizing they're really not. And that makes them think that they're second-class citizens because they're still not being treated equally. And two, it's re-traumatizing a group of people that's already been very traumatized by the church. And so I think finding an affirming community that is truly safe and will embrace you is very critical. And I'm very thankful for Church Clarity because of that, because you can go on and search for a church in your area and find out where they stand on LGBT, will they hire women in ministry, and it's very clearly outlined. So you know exactly where they stand. And Church Clarity isn't asking people to change their stance. They're asking them to be transparent about their stance so that people know before they arrive what to expect, and so they don't get in the door and then end up more damaged than before they came in.
You wrote a lot about boundaries, and you spoke about it just a moment ago. That is something that really has to be, you have to really get good at that, I'm guessing, or it'll kill your soul.
Yeah, and that's a lot of practice because we're not taught boundaries.
No.
Nobody likes boundaries. Boundaries are hard. Boundaries are uncomfortable. And for me, I had never been taught how to set healthy boundaries. And so when I started doing it, it was just as hard for me to do it as it was for my parents didn't like it either because I had never done that before. So it was just as hard for them to accept it as it was for me to do it. And yet it was necessary for the safety of my mental health and my physical health, and and so navigating that, I think, is different for each person what those boundaries look like, but I think it's important to find that for yourself and what you need to do for yourself to keep yourself mentally and physically safe and healthy.
You wrote about coping with conditional love. You're taught your whole life unconditional love. It's all about unconditional love. You even said in the first book, you said your mom said to you, Amber, friends will come and go, but your family will always be there for you.
Yeah.
And then you realize not necessarily so. That had to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, that was something my mom said all the time. That was a very common household saying. So I grew up expecting and believing it to be true. And when I realized it wasn't, that was just devastating, because I was taught that the love of God was unconditional and that the love of my parents was unconditional. And yet when it came down to it, they didn't believe that either of those were true, because they believed that in order to get to heaven, you had to be A, B, and C. You had to be straight or celibate or one of these things that you had to follow. And in order to be loved by them, I had to be one of those things. And so it came with strings attached. It wasn't truly unconditional love in their eyes.
When I read that book, and everything was kind of still separate, family was not together, and then I read this book. Has the family come back together any? Is it kind of resembling something that's where they're accepting and they're getting it?
No, we have been completely estranged since I got married. So we have had no contact whatsoever. And I mean, that goes for all of my family, my parents, my brother, my extended family, my grandparents. We just have no contact.
It is amazing to me, because I look at you and I think everybody in the world would be so proud. They should be so proud. And to know that the people that were closest to you, they can't get it yet. And I'm just going to hold out hope that they can get it, because they should be so proud, so very proud. You did something I thought was brilliant. You took Kubler-Ross. You familiar with Kubler-Ross, who wrote the stages of death?
Grief.
And grief, she talks about when you find out you were going through grief, you go through anger, you go through these stages. But you adapted it for LGBTQ. Can you talk just a minute about that? Because I thought that was very helpful too.
Well, I tried to adapt it for LGBTQ people, because you do go through, the majority of LGBT people go through some degree of grief and loss. It's different for every person. Some have more than others, but you do go through that. And so I tried to adapt it and give examples of what it may look like during each stage to help them identify that, and to help their loved ones understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Even at the end of every chapter in Unashamed, I have a section for parents and allies to know how you can support your loved one at that point in their coming out process and what would be most helpful. So I try to give as many tools, not only to the LGBT person, but to their parents and allies as well.
We're going to do some Q&A in just a few minutes, but we're going to actually close down the live stream that we're doing. But before we do, would you just look maybe straight ahead into the camera back there and just talk to maybe that LGBT person who maybe is contemplating coming out but is just afraid, doesn't know if it's going to work out? Can you just talk to him just a moment?
I want you to know that you're not alone. You're not nearly as isolated as you feel. There are so many people that are so ready and willing to gather around you and support you. You just got to reach out for them. And I want you to know that God loves you and God smiles on you, and you are completely and fully loved by God exactly as you are, and there's nothing that you have to do to change that or to earn it. It is truly unconditional love. And I want you to be able to embrace who you are fully, and to really know that God embraces you.
It has been an honor to get to talk to you. It has been truly amazing. And I want to say to you, if you're watching, I want to tell you, if you feel like this is helpful to someone you know, you share this link with them and let them watch it. It'll be online forever. Let people watch this, because they will not hear a more articulate expression of coming out and being a Christian and understanding the beauty of all of this. And so please make sure you do that. Amber, I'm telling you, I feel like I have made a lifelong friend. I feel like just knowing you today, I have made a friend that is going to be lifelong. You are awesome. Did you enjoy, Amber? Was this beautiful? Beautiful.